As Joel and I were talking about our favorite watercraft before the 9 o'clock service, I revealed that I also like quiet paddles, which is why my wife and I have a canoe. But there's a little bit of a different vibe in the canoe than the kayak, or at least a little bit of a different vibe than in the canoe than the single kayak. I think most of us who have co-piloted a canoe with a beloved or a family member have asked ourselves the question, or maybe we've dared to ask it aloud, are you steering or am I? We love, right? Don't act like you haven't thought it, at least. We love a clear role, a clear set of expectations. We want to know exactly what we're supposed to be doing. Am I steering? Are you steering? What's happening? Oh, beautiful. See, it's always, I want it to be a good tune. That's all I ask for. We want to know what's expected of us. We want a clear role. Are you steering or am I? But these clear roles, these clear expectations and definitions of who we are and what we are supposed to be doing, we long for them so in our primate brains, and yet I have found that these clearly defined models sometimes do as much harm as good. In the days and weeks and months, and maybe if I am honest, even the years after my wife Catherine gave birth to our daughter Ada, I would have paid any amount of money for a clear role, a clear set of expectations defining what I ought to do, now that the work of nurturing our newborn could be done by more than one person. I longed for some Hallmark card recognition of my experience of motherhood, which seemed somehow perpetually caught in the space of neither this nor that. I started to resign myself to a lifetime of just passive-aggressively crossing out the word father on forms, trying to make our family fit into databases and camp enrollments that had never really anticipated our existence. Our religious forebears were also people whose lives were lived in pursuit of new models, new roles, new molds to fit their callings. And perhaps you weren't ready for this hard turn from non-gestational lesbian motherhood to Puritans. So everybody take a breath. Here we go. Right? As Reverend Christina talked about during the Wonder Box, these early English settlers to what they called New England, though it was not new to the human beings who were in fact living there when they got there, right? But that they arrived with a clear sense that those structures, those oppressive structures from the Church of England, right, how a church was organized and governed, the role and purpose of clergy, that those were deeply broken and out of line with their interpretation of Christian scripture. And they gathered in small meetings in people's homes to draft that letter, that Cambridge platform that they sent back to England, a very bold middle finger to the king. Right? That they began to describe exactly how it would be organized, if not the thing that they were rebelling against. And that their sense of how a church is structured and organized, we have inherited it. And that is why I say, whether you are excited to claim them or not, the Puritans are in fact some of our religious forebears. Some of the defining characteristics, some of which Reverend Christina talked about earlier. One is that we have accountable relationships among the congregants and the community. Right? That you are in relationship with each other and that our values guide how we are in relationship with each other and with the wider community. The second sort of defining piece that we still have today is that the democratic process and democratic processes define how power moves in the congregation. Right? That when you grant the governing board the authority to sort of handle the stewardship of our finances and our physical plant and our vision. You do that through a democratic process. When you ordain a minister like you did with Reverend Allie, who had been your intern, when you ordain a minister, you do that through a democratic process. When you call a minister, as you have with Reverend Christina, and as you are considering doing for me, that's a democratic process. The power and authority moves through those processes, not because some bishop so-and-so says that so-and-so is now your priest. And the final way is what the fancy word for it. So are you ready to learn a fancy word? Sure. Orthopraxy. Ooh. Right? That we do not do orthodoxy here, which means right doctrine. We don't do doctrine, right? We don't do creeds. So we don't care about whether your doctrine is correct here. Here we talk about orthopraxy. How's your practice or your praxis? Right? What do you do in your life? How are you living our values? How are we living our values? Orthopraxy is the fancy, like, million-dollar word version of deeds, not creeds. And so our religious lineage is full of breaking the mold. From this moment in our church structure and organization in the Cambridge platform, we just couldn't help ourselves. Early Unitarians and Universalists just kept breaking the mold that they had been given about what it means to do and be church. Early descendants of these Puritans began to find the theological restrictions of those same Puritans. You will perhaps be shocked that people found the theology of the Puritans a little restrictive. Right? They found it a little too confining, that puritanical reading of Scripture, because these early ancestors of ours started to read more and more the Gospels for themselves and see that they thought that Jesus' humanity was way more important than his divinity, and not really find evidence for the Trinity in the Gospels. So they broke the mold and struck out, eventually, over a couple centuries of very spicy pamphlet writing, create the American Unitarian Association, a denomination founded on the concept of rejecting the Trinity. But of course, we could not sit still for very long, and by the mid-1800s, some Unitarians began to feel limited by defining their theology and their spirituality solely through a Christian scriptural framework. And so they started to explore, they started to dabble in how poetry, Eastern religious texts, and other mystical experiences might inform their Unitarianism. Today, we call many of them the Transcendentalists. They broke the mold. And if you've ever said that your spiritual practice as a Unitarian Universalist is hiking, kayaking, being in nature, you can thank this mold break and Unitarians like Ralph Waldo Emerson, who broke and then rebuilt the mold of what it meant to be a Unitarian around that time. Oh, but we couldn't sit still. And so in the first half of the 1900s, more and more Unitarians began to struggle with the supernaturalism inherent in Christian theology. They began to explore humanism that rejected traditional concepts of God entirely. And of the 34 signatories of the original 1933 Humanist Manifesto, 15 were Unitarians, including many prominent clergy. Its primary author, the primary author of the original Humanist Manifesto was Unitarian minister Raymond Bragg, who was not like a nobody. He was the secretary of the Western Unitarian Conference, right? He was not some like rando in obscurity. It was a prominent Unitarian minister who authored the Humanist Manifesto that broke the mold of what it meant to be religious, right? That the idea that religion is concerned with a deity, with the afterlife, with, why bad things happen to good people. They took that mold of religion and they broke it beyond recognition. Throughout all of these broken molds, though, one role persisted, relatively unchanged. In all of these moments and movements, there was a very highly educated white man vested with the honorific of reverend at the helm. And while there were certainly a few women and people of color who managed to become ordained as Unitarians or Universalists beginning in the second half of the 1800s, they were A, very much the exception, and B, tended to succeed in spite of the institution rather than because of it. And even as Unitarian Universalist ministry began to diversify in earnest in the 1980s, right, to the point where there are now more women than men in Unitarian Universalist ministry, right, that even as the ministry, the people who were ministers began to diversify, the role of minister persisted, mostly unchanged, just with a more diverse group of people in the pulpit. Maybe this one just makes sense, right? Maybe this is just the mold that makes sense, and that's why it's persisted so much. It seems as if these traditional molds, models, these structures, roles, and institutions that you could always count on are breaking all around us these days at a faster pace than any of us perhaps wants. You know, back when I was still just jumping down the throat of any stranger or medical provider who made assumptions about our family structure, I wondered if that was not a position that I could maintain for the entirety of my children's growing up years, and wondered if there might be a different path that I might tread. So I started to talk more to other parents and read, essays and books from other parents about, and ran in to other people talking about this deep ache that I felt around what my role as a mom was. And it was fascinating to me, amazing, astonishing even, to learn that this deep sense that the model we had been handed about what it meant to be a mother was somehow so flawed as to be useless, right? That ache around the set of expectations we had been handed, right? That was not confined to those of us who had been forced to break the mold because of how we constructed our families. That, in fact, many parents felt that this set of unspoken and inherited expectations around mothering, fathering, and parenting landed somewhere between unhelpful and downright harmful. And you don't have to take my word for it. Surgeon General Vivek Murthy has recently been on a press tour about a truly depressing report that he has put together about the strain and mental health of parents. You can read the articles about it, but I will share 2 statistics that stopped me in my tracks, and I hope they stop you in yours. 4 in 10 parents say that on most days they are so stressed they cannot function. Nearly half of all parents say that most days their stress is completely overwhelming. Right? 4 in 10 parents say that on most days they are so stressed they cannot function. What? I dare say that the set of expectations and roles we have been handed around what it means to parent are broken. And so maybe the mold never really worked in the first place. Maybe it has been broken far longer than any of us would care to admit. In seminary, one of my professors, the Reverend Dr. Carl Gregg, is also the minister at the Unitarian Universalist Church in Frederick, Maryland, shared a sermon and an essay that I can only describe as a survey of all the famous Unitarian and Universalist ministers who worked themselves to death. And then he shares the example of one minister who didn't work himself to death and lived a nice long life. Died at 94. His name was James Luther Adams. And while James Luther Adams had not worked himself to death, he had certainly given more of his life to his work than his family. And during the question and answer time of the 2013 James Luther Adams lecture at Meadville Lombard Seminary, a member of the audience, who was a former student of James Luther Adams, said that having realized the extent of the anger of one of Adams's daughters, right, that she had for her father because of his inattention, this former student confessed to the daughter at the memorial service for Adams, "I was one of the students who stole time with your father that he should have spent with you." And his daughter wept. After learning this story in seminary, I was determined that I would not be that kind of parent, that I wouldn't leave a legacy of ministry that my children or my spouse resented. But the lesson that has taken me a little longer to learn is that I don't actually want to be that kind of minister either. I don't want to keep reinvesting in the model, in the mold of the highly educated, all-powerful, all-knowing minister at the top of the organizational chart. I want to reinvent it. I want to break this mold that we have lived with since before the Revolutionary War. There is very little that we're still doing today that we've done since before the Revolutionary War that's a good idea. Very little. And the one sort of movement within Unitarian Universalism that broke out of that mold of the sort of highly educated, all-powerful clergy at the top of the organizational chart was something called the Fellowship Movement, a church planting effort between the mid-1940s and mid-1960s that is part of what birthed this place. This place that was without a clergy leader for several decades at the beginning of its lifetime as a congregation. And the UUA sort of says this about the fellowship movement. Fellowships understood from the beginning that lay involvement, that's you all, was essential to survival and success. While Unitarian Universalism has a long and proud history of lay leadership, some have seen in the fellowship movement the birth of shared ministry. The sharing, though, was among congregants rather than with a minister. And so the fellowship movement helped this place break out of one restrictive structure, but sometimes, right, it's the pendulum swing where you're so tired of top-down authority that you come over here and then you can't share your toys with anyone. And so we, by asking you all to consider calling me as a co-minister with Reverend Christina, we are embarking on a path that acknowledges the gifts of those of us called and ordained, which is a word that really means set aside for the work of this ministry, and the gifts of dedicated lay leaders like you all. Right? We're trying to embark on a path that acknowledges both of those, and the reality that we are all human and that our gifts might best serve the cause of love and justice with partnership and collaboration at the forefront. And so we're asking you to break the mold, to define leadership differently, to build a congregation where the way we have always done it does not have to be inevitable going forward. As Joel said, time moves in but one direction. And this is my favorite part, right? To use the principles we inherited from the Puritans to empower two people who would make those, Puritans just roll in their graves that we are clergy. Sometimes I think about that. I picture a Puritan rising from the dead and seeing me in the pulpit and then just passing right back out. So good. Right? To use those democratic processes to move power in this congregation, to empower us to lead you in a way that's different, that breaks the mold. But I think that's worth doing. May it be so.